Be in English because Annie is from Great Britain, not from England. She'll explain that in a minute. And she's also my girlfriend, in full disclosure. And she will talk a bit about the same things that I just talked about, except she'll be talking from personal experience since she used to work for the British Secret Service in the 90s. So, Annie, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Just a quick question to kick off. How many of you will admit to having watched and enjoyed Spooks? Yay, 1, 2, hey, that's not bad. That's brave, socially brave. What about James Bond and The Bourne Ultimatum, all those sort of films? Yeah.
Enjoyed.
Well, I'm going to prick that bubble. It's nothing like that when you work as a spy, of course, of course, of course. The basic role, when you're employed as an intelligence officer for MI5, is you run operations. You basically identify what is a threat to the country, to national security, and then you have this array of different techniques by which you can investigate the threat. You can run agents into groups, obviously. You can bug their telephones, their internet, you can put bugs in their flats and homes and eavesdrop on them. You can use satellites to spy on them. You know, all the techie stuff. But the problem is, there is no real oversight to these agencies. There is no effective oversight. They are a law unto themselves, and they are running amok at the moment. So I just wanted to run you through some of the stuff that I saw when I was working on the inside, which will explain why I ended up as a whistleblower against MI5 and had to go on the run from them across Europe. And also put it in some more current context, which is touching on some of the issues that Ian was talking about before. But my story starts quite a long time ago now. I was recruited back in 1990 to be an intelligence officer for MI5. And at that point, they were trying to reinvent themselves. In the UK, we have 3 agencies. We have MI5 that protects the country. We have MI6, which is a sort of James Bond organisation, goes out and gathers intelligence abroad. And we have GCHQ, which eavesdrops. That's the technical side, where they listen to our telephone conversations and things. So MI5 was the group that approached me. Now, I don't know why. I'd applied to be a diplomat after I came down from the university, and suddenly had a letter in the post on Ministry of Defence notepaper saying, we may have other jobs you would find more interesting. And my initial gut instinct was, fuck, it's MI5. And I was really frightened. I'd never even conceived or had an interest in being a spy. Unfortunately, my father was in the room with me when I opened the letter. I would have ignored it, but he was a complete spy geek. He just loved James Bond, John le Carré, Len Dayton, the whole thing. So he said, oh, go on, just please ring them up and see if it is MI5. So after about 10 months of recruitment, then there I was, walking into their HQ in London to learn to be a spy. Now, 1990 was an interesting year for them because, of course, the Berlin Wall had come down the year before. The Cold War was over. So their whole raison d'etre were pretty much vanished by that point. They were there to stop Soviet espionage, and they were there to investigate political activism in the UK. So suddenly, that whole thing had disappeared. They had also, for the first time in their 80-year existence, been put on a legal footing. So from 1909 to 1989, none of the spy agencies officially existed. They were completely off the radar. Our democratically elected representatives could not ask questions about them. Their whole existence was deniable, and that, of course, meant they could work completely outside the law as well, because nobody knew what they got up to. That changed in 1989. They were put on a legal footing, and suddenly they were expected to adhere to basic democratic law. So, for example, if they wanted to break into your house, plant a bug, which would otherwise be a crime, housebreaking, they had to get permission from their political masters. And also, as I said, the Cold War was over, so they were looking for some new work, and they were repositioning themselves as a counter-terrorism organisation. So when I was being recruited, they went to great pains to say, of course, you know, the bad old days of investigating Reds under the bed were over. They no longer investigated left-wing political activists. They were a counter-terrorism organisation. They had to obey the law, and they wanted a new generation of intelligence officers to do the counter-terrorism work. So I thought, okay, fine. It was a 10-month recruitment process. It went on for a long, long time, stage after stage after stage of intensive exercises and examinations and all the rest of it. And of course, because it's MI5, you think they know everything about you. So you're 110% honest when you're answering the questions. No sort of gliding over little holes in your curriculum vitae or anything. And I still kept getting through. And I was surprised all the way through. So So by the time I got there, I thought, well, you know, perhaps I must be right for this job. Perhaps they are as they describe themselves now. They're no longer some evil, strike-breaking political organisation. So it was a bit of a surprise when my first posting was announced to me. I was sent to a little section called F2, which was a hangover from the Cold War, which was there to investigate political activism in the UK. And I was assigned to look at left-wing extremist groups. Now, I have to say in my defence, I did spend those 2 years trying to shut down the investigations because I could not see how micro-groups with Trotskyist politics would actually affect our national security. But it gave me quite an interesting insight into the old work that they had got up to, because I saw a lot of the old files. There were about 1 million files held on people in the UK citizens, purely for their political beliefs. And amongst those were a number of people who had political aspirations, who went on, after the 1997 general election, to become Labour government ministers. So MI5 had files on people from Tony Blair down. Anyone who has been anyone in British politics for the last decade pretty much had an MI5 file, usually for some sort of student activism they'd done in their radical youth. It's terribly embarrassing for them now to be reminded that they had some sort of radical youth, but anyway, that was the case. And I think this is a real problem for a democracy, where you have the spies holding secret information on the people who are supposed to be running them, their bosses, their political masters, the people who are supposed to be holding them to account. And I think every time in the UK when we see our Labour government throwing more money, more staff, more powers at the spies to fight the war on terror, it's always worth bearing that in the back of our minds. I don't know how the system works in this country, but I'm willing to bet it's pretty much the same, that your spy agencies will have looked at political activists and will be looking at political activists. I spent about 6 years in MI5 and I had 3 postings there. So as a political staff, then I worked against Irish terrorism, and this was pretty much at the height of the IRA UK mainland campaign, when they were putting bombs down at will on UK streets. And then I worked in the international terrorism section. Now the Irish side was interesting and also quite rewarding. We did have some good results, you know, stopping some attacks, but there was a sort of vast array of incompetence where terrorists were allowed to roam free and where they were exploding bombs pretty much at will, as I said, including one of the most notorious cases, which was the bombing of the City of London in 1993. And this is where a lorry bomb was driven and parked in an area called Bishopsgate. And it was about a ton of homemade explosive. And it just detonated, killed one person, injured many more, and also caused about £350 million worth of damage, which was way more than had been caused in the whole of the civil war in Northern Ireland itself up to that date. But crucially, the terrorist who detonated that bomb should have been arrested 6 months earlier. He was actually caught red-handed tending another lorry bomb, which was parked up in an industrial car park in the north of London. And MI5 and the police knew it was full of homemade explosive. They knew that they could go in and arrest this guy, but they had to get the order from the head of the counter-terrorism branch in the Metropolitan Police. And crucially, that guy was not contactable that night. This is pre-mobile phones. I mean, he did have a pager, but he couldn't be contacted. Now, rumours went round MI5 that, in fact, he was with his mistress that night, which is why he had everything switched off, but we still don't know to this day. But anyway, this guy, his name was Cyril Jimmy McGuinness, the IRA terrorist, went ahead and bombed Bishopsgate, as I said. So you have to wonder, is it just cock-up or whatever? I think probably it was cock-up in this particular case. As I said, I also worked on the international side of things. That was my final posting in MI5, a section called G Branch. And this was when Al-Qaeda was becoming to be known, at least within the intelligence community, as the new big threat. My partner, ex-partner, David Shaler, who was also an officer of MI5, was working in that section at the time as well, and he was the head of the Libyan section. So he was tasked with investigating Libyan terrorists, the Libyan regime within the country, what they were getting up to against Libyan dissidents in London. And we saw a number of things going wrong in that section that led us to decide to leave, to resign from MI5, and also to blow the whistle, which is quite a step in the UK for legal reasons. But just in a nutshell, there are 3 cases that really worried us. The first of all was an illegal phone tapping operation. And you might think, well, they probably do that all the time. Well, yeah, they do, but this was quite a high-profile one, where a very prominent UK journalist called Victoria Britton, who was the deputy foreign editor of the Guardian newspaper, was targeted for 6 months And they went in and they bugged her telephone at the cost of, I think, about £750,000 without any intelligence to do so. They just basically thought, great, she's a lefty. It's like the good old days, we can go and investigate a left-wing journalist. Wasted all this money. And crucially, they did not carry out the basic checks that were required to make that phone tap legal under all these new laws that they had to operate within. In fact, all she was doing was fighting a legal libel case on behalf of someone who had links to the Libyan regime. That was it. There was no more hardcore terrorist intelligence around this woman. But the two big cases that made us quit were two cases of false flag terrorist attacks. And the first one was the bombing of the Israeli embassy in London in 1994. Now, in this case, a car bomb, a very sophisticated device, was driven and parked outside the Israeli embassy, where it was exploded. Now, it was very sophisticated because it was built so that it consumed itself, and very few organisations can do that. Even the IRA, which was, again, a very developed terrorist organisation, could not build bombs that would actually consume itself and get rid of most of the forensics. This did. Also, nobody, fortunately, was killed. There were a few minor injuries. But, yeah, it was an interesting case because all the senior diplomats in the Israeli embassy were out that day against all regulation and rules within that embassy. And it turned out, in the assessment of a senior MI5 officer, and his James Bond sort of number was G91, I know who he is, turned out that in his assessment, having seen all the evidence around this case, and all the intelligence, which crucially is not necessarily admissible in court, he reckoned that Mossad had carried out the bombing itself against its own embassy in London. And now, if you read that on the internet, you think that's some wild conspiracy theory. But his thinking was twofold. The Israeli government was always pressuring MI5 to up the threat level to its interests in London. They kept saying, you know, you're full of Palestinian terrorists, they're bound to attack us one day. And MI5 kept turning around and saying, well, there's no evidence that they are going to try and attack you. We are not upping the threat level from moderate. Of course, setting off a controlled and sophisticated explosion immediately ranked up the threat. But the main thing, I think, and this was G91's assessment, was that there were some Palestinians in London who were causing problems. They'd set up a political network to send aid and raise awareness about the plight of the Palestinians on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And this was an operation designed to shatter that network, because a number of people involved in that political network were rounded up and arrested. And two of those people were charged, put on trial and convicted of conspiracy to cause those attacks. So, of course, that network just shattered, ran for the hills, and to this day has not got back on its feet. So if G91 was accurate and correct about this, of course they actually achieved a good political aim, as far as Mossad would be concerned, to get rid of an irritant in London. Now, those two people are still in prison, despite the fact that this information came out in the late 1990s, despite the fact that under all due process of the law, they should have been given an appeal. They've proclaimed their innocence ever since they were convicted, but they are both serving 20-year sentences, and they're still rotting in prison to this day. It's just disgraceful. But the final case I just want to brush over is the case really that made Shayla and I quit. And as I said, he was the head of the Libyan section in MI5. And he unusually had a good working relationship with his counterparts in MI6. This is a sort of James Bond wing. Normally the two groups hate each other, the two organisations loathe each other because they're competing for power and resources and status, and they do not work well together. But unusually he developed a good working relationship. So come late 1995, he went across to MI6's HQ, you know, that sort of ziggurat building you always see in the sort of spy films, and was briefed officially about an unfolding plot in Libya. Now, in this case, there was a volunteer, a walk-in, as they're known. It was a Libyan military intelligence officer, had gone to the British Embassy in Tunis to find the local MI6 officer. They're always based in embassies, so it's very easy to find them. And he said he had a cunning plan. He wanted to talk to MI6 because he had, quote, a group of ragtag Islamic extremists in Libya who were prepared to try and effect a coup against Colonel Gaddafi. They had the people in place, and they had the contacts as well throughout the establishment, but they needed funding to try and carry out this attack. Now, MI6, and it just fell for this hook, line and sinker. They carried out very few checks on this guy. Turned out he was a Libyan military intelligence officer. He was codenamed Tomworth by MI5. And they